She gave birth to her daughter in an off-grid cabin with no hospital within reach, no running water, and a Maine winter pressing against the walls. That woman is Amy Westerlind, one half of Holdfast, Alaska, a channel that went from 0 to over 200,000 subscribers in months. And the story behind how she got there reveals a version of her that most people who watch the channel have never actually seen. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly who Amy Westerlind is beneath the content, the choices she made long before there was a camera, and why every single one of them was deliberate. Plans start with the apartment, because this is where almost every misunderstanding about Amy begins. Before Alaska, before Maine, before any of it, Amy Westerlind was living in a standard Massachusetts apartment with her husband Dennis, working a desk job as the secretary for her father-in-law's lobster company. That's the starting point. Not a farm, not a rural upbringing, not a family with homesteading in the bloodline, a Massachusetts apartment, an office job, and no land of any kind. But here's what most people gloss over when they tell this part of the story. Amy was already building something. She grew tomatoes in pots on the apartment patio. That detail sounds small. It isn't. In a space where most people would have put deck chairs and called it done, Amy was experimenting with what she could grow, what she could preserve, and how much food she could pull from the smallest possible footprint. The patio tomatoes weren't a hobby. They were the first iteration of a food system she would spend the next decade scaling up. She was also reading, studying. The herbalism that would later define her role on the homestead didn't appear out of nowhere on a piece of Maine land. It started in that apartment, with books, with research, and with a decision that she was going to become genuinely competent in something that most modern people have completely forgotten. Herbal medicine, the identification, preparation, and application of medicinal plants, is not a casual interest. It requires years of study before it becomes reliable. Amy started that clock long before the land existed. What she and Dennis were doing in that Massachusetts apartment wasn't just dreaming. They were planning. There's a difference. Dreaming is talking about a life you'd like to have. Planning is growing tomatoes in pots on an apartment balcony because you're already testing what you're going to need. And if you think the plan started with a search engine, it didn't. What happened next is the reason this story spread across the internet. The land that started everything cost approximately $5,000. Amy and Dennis found it on Craigslist. That's not a detail the channel dwells on, but it matters, because it means the barrier to entry for what they built wasn't wealth, it was decision. Most people who talk about wanting to homestead are waiting for a version of themselves that has more money, more skill, and more certainty. Amy and Dennis didn't wait. They found 30 acres in rural Maine for $5,000 down, signed the paperwork, and moved into a tent, in March. There was no cabin yet, no electricity, no running water, no internet connection. They lived in that tent while building the cabin themselves, from scratch, with no prior construction experience, significant enough to make it easy. The cabin they built isn't a glamorous structure in the early descriptions. It's a functional one, built by two people who had never done it before and chose to learn by doing it for real rather than practicing on something smaller first. Amy's role in the Maine years is the part of this story that viewers most consistently underestimate. She wasn't the person standing beside Dennis while he built things. She was actively developing the internal architecture of the homestead, the food systems, the preservation methods, the medicinal plant knowledge that would turn a piece of rural land into a functioning, largely self-sufficient household. That work is less photogenic than swinging an axe. It's also harder to acquire than carpentry, because it requires accumulated knowledge rather than physical labor alone. This is when the herbalism practice became serious. Maine provided the plant diversity to actually apply what she'd been studying. She learned to identify, harvest, prepare, and store medicinal plants across 4 seasons, building a working pharmacopoeia that the family could draw on without driving to a pharmacy. In a place with no running water and a long winter, this isn't a lifestyle aesthetic, it's a practical system. Most people who know this story stop here, but the real story starts right now. Lena Westerlind was born in 2019 in that Maine cabin. Amy chose to give birth at home, off-grid, in a cabin she and Dennis had built by hand, without the proximity to a hospital that most Americans consider a non-negotiable baseline. That decision tells you more about Amy Westerlind than almost anything else in this story. A home birth in a modern suburban house, close to medical infrastructure, is already a significant choice. A home birth in a remote off-grid cabin in western Maine is a different category of decision entirely. It requires deep preparation, genuine trust in the process, a detailed understanding of what your body is doing and what to watch for, and a conscious acceptance that you are operating outside the systems most people rely on without thinking about it. That acceptance, the willingness to exit systems rather than modify them, is the defining characteristic of how Amy approaches almost every major decision in this story. It's not recklessness. Reckless people don't spend years studying herbalism before they need it. It's philosophy. Amy's philosophy, as it becomes visible across the arc of her choices, is that dependence on external systems is a form of vulnerability, and that genuine skill and preparation can reduce that vulnerability to something manageable. The home birth isn't an isolated decision. It's the same logic as the patio tomatoes in Massachusetts, the same logic as the Craigslist land, the same logic as spending years becoming a herbalist before there was any practical urgency to be one. Amy consistently moves towards self-sufficiency, not because she rejects the modern world on principle, but because she has decided that knowing how to do things yourself is more valuable than any convenience the alternative provides. Lena grew up in that cabin. She would be 5 years old by the time the family left Maine entirely and headed for Alaska. And that's when the decision was made, the one nobody around her saw coming. The first Alaska chapter doesn't fit the story most people construct around Holdfast, Alaska, and that's precisely why it matters. When the family arrived in Alaska in late 2020, after a 3,200-mile drive and a 5-day ferry crossing through seas that hit 36 feet, they didn't go directly to the remote interior. They settled on 2 acres on the outskirts of the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. 2 acres, on the outskirts of a wildlife refuge. By the standards of most American homesteaders, that's an extraordinary location. By Amy Westerlind standards, it wasn't enough. During the Kenai years, Amy did something that almost never gets mentioned in coverage of the channel. She worked in real estate. The woman who had left her Massachusetts desk job, built a cabin from a tent, and given birth off-grid was now, temporarily, working in property sales on the Kenai Peninsula. This isn't a contradiction, it's a strategy. The family needed income while they assessed what Alaska actually looked like from the inside, figured out where they genuinely wanted to be, and built the financial runway for the next move. She also herd-shared goats during this period, a dairy arrangement where multiple families share ownership of an animal to split both the work and the milk yield. It's a detail that reveals something consistent about how Amy solves problems. She finds ways to access what she needs without requiring full ownership or full infrastructure. The patio tomatoes, the Craigslist land, the herd share arrangement, small, practical solutions that accumulate into something larger. But the Kenai didn't satisfy her. She described it, and Dennis has echoed this, as feeling too much like Maine, too developed, too networked into the infrastructure of accessible Alaska, rather than the version of Alaska they had actually come for. The wildlife refuge was beautiful. The community was there, and it still wasn't remote enough. Here's what the comments kept asking. And here's the answer they never got, until now. Why would someone who had already relocated twice, from Massachusetts to Maine, from Maine to coastal Alaska, push to go even further into the wilderness? The answer is more specific than it sounds, and it starts with how Amy thinks about what homesteading actually is. For a lot of people who move toward off-grid living, the goal is a certain aesthetic. The wood stove, the root cellar, the chickens, the lifestyle that photographs well and provides enough of a departure from suburban life to feel meaningful. That's a legitimate version of the project. It's not Amy's version. Amy's version is about the elimination of dependency, not as a political statement, not as survivalist anxiety, as a practical, daily orientation toward a life where the systems that sustain you are the ones you've built, understand, and can maintain yourself. The Kenai Peninsula offered beautiful land and Alaskan wilderness proximity. It did not offer subsistence zone access. That distinction matters enormously to how Amy thinks about the homestead. A federally designated subsistence zone in Alaska gives qualifying residents priority access to fish and wildlife resources that aren't available under standard state or federal recreational rules. In practice, it means that Amy and Dennis, once they relocated to the area near Slana and the northern boundary of Wrangell-St. Elias, could harvest up to 500 salmon per year as part of their food system. That's not supplementary, that's a primary protein source for 12 months. The goats on the Kenai were a workaround. The salmon near Slana are a cornerstone. This is the version of the move that nobody in the audience fully processes when they watch the channel. The relocation from the Kenai Peninsula to the interior near Wrangell-St. Elias wasn't about going deeper into the wilderness because it looked better on camera. It was a strategic food systems decision. And Amy, the woman who had been designing food systems since the apartment patio, understood exactly what she was moving toward. At this point in the story, most people walked away. What she did instead is the part nobody talks about. Every channel about homesteading has someone who hunts or fishes. Not every channel has someone who can take the result of a hunt or a fishing season and architect an entire year's food supply from it. That's the role Amy plays on the Holdfast Alaska homestead, and it is one of the most systematically undervalued things happening on the channel. When the salmon run comes in, the family is harvesting fish at a volume that most American households don't consume in a decade. 500 salmon. The question of what to do with 500 salmon, how to split them across smoking, drying, fermenting, canning, and freezing in a way that provides optimal nutrition, variety, and shelf stability through an Alaskan winter, is not a simple question. It requires real knowledge of food preservation chemistry, real equipment, real process discipline, and real experience knowing which methods fail under which conditions. Amy manages that system. She also manages the moose harvest when it occurs, the root cellar storage, the fermentation programs, cultured vegetables, wild plant preparations, preserved mushrooms, and the medicinal plant stores that function as the household's first-line health resource in a location that is genuinely far from medical care. The nearest significant medical facility from their current homestead near Slana is not close. The medicinal plant knowledge she started building in a Massachusetts apartment is, at this point, operational infrastructure. None of this is visible in the way that felling a tree is visible. The camera captures the dramatic moments. Amy's contribution is often the long, careful, technical work that happens before and after those moments. The processing, the preservation, the storage management that makes the dramatic moments mean something across a full year rather than just across a news cycle. Dennis built the log cabin structures. Amy built the systems inside them. And if you think that was surprising, stay with me because this next part is why the whole story matters. Holdfast Alaska has a daughter on the homestead. Most people who watch the channel know this. But if you pay attention to how Lena appears in the content, or more precisely, how deliberately she doesn't, you start to see a pattern that says a great deal about Amy. Lena is present in the homestead's life. She is part of what the family is building and why they're building it. But her face, her full identity, and the specific personal details of her childhood are kept carefully off camera. This is an active, deliberate choice, not an oversight, not a shy kid who doesn't want to appear, but a considered decision by Amy and Dennis about what their daughter consents to and what she doesn't. In the current landscape of family YouTube, this is genuinely unusual. The economic logic of family content pushes creators toward putting children front and center. Kids drive engagement, kids drive subscriber attachment, kids drive merch. The Holdfast Alaska model runs in the opposite direction. The child is protected rather than monetized. The homestead life is the content. Lena's interior life is not. This circles back to the same philosophy that produced the home birth decision, the Craigslist land, the herbalism practice, the subsistence zone relocation. Amy's approach to parenting, like her approach to food systems and medical preparedness, is organized around a core belief that the people in her care should not be dependent on or vulnerable to systems they didn't choose and can't control. A child whose face is on the internet before they can articulate a preference about it has been inserted into a system without their consent. Amy opted out of that on Lena's behalf. That decision has a cost. Other family homesteading channels with children prominently featured have grown faster. Amy accepted that trade-off and made it anyway. She never talked about this publicly, until now. Holdfast Alaska launched in September 2024. Within months, it had crossed 200,000 subscribers. That growth is fast by any metric, but it's especially fast for a homesteading channel with no drama, no controversy, no relationship crisis, and no viral moment outside of the content itself. What drove it wasn't an algorithm trick or a trending topic, it was the credibility gap. There is a specific thing that Holdfast Alaska has that most homesteading content does not, and Amy is a significant part of why that thing exists. The channel is not performing a lifestyle, the channel is documenting one. The difference between those two things is usually invisible to a casual viewer, but it becomes visible over time through the texture of the details. The way Amy talks about plant preservation isn't the way someone talks about it after reading a blog post. The way she describes food storage isn't the way someone describes it after watching another creator do it. It's the language of someone who has been doing the thing for over a decade and has failed at versions of it enough times to know what actually matters. Audiences feel that difference before they can name it. The channel grew because people could feel, even if they couldn't articulate, that the knowledge on screen was real. Amy went from a Massachusetts apartment with a patio full of tomato pots to a 7-acre off-grid log cabin in one of the most remote homesteading locations in North America. She became a herbalist, a food preservation specialist, a home birth mother, a real estate agent, a goat dairy woman, and a subsistence salmon processor across 14 years of increasingly intentional living. The YouTube channel is the most recent layer. It is built on top of everything else. And here's what nobody who watches the channel has fully reckoned with. The channel could disappear tomorrow, and Amy Westerlind's life would not change in any significant way. The knowledge would remain, the food systems would remain, the homestead would remain. The channel is the record of a life, not the reason for it. The thing that makes Amy Westerlind worth understanding isn't that she moved to Alaska. Plenty of people move to Alaska. It's that every step she took, from the apartment patio in Massachusetts to a cabin at the edge of Wrangell St. Elias, was part of a single, continuous act of building toward a life she could genuinely sustain without asking anyone else to hold it together for her. Right now, the Holdfast Alaska channel is still growing. The homestead near Slana is active. Amy is managing the food systems, the preservation work, the medicinal plant stores, and the content that documents all of it, while deliberately keeping her daughter's life private, in an era where most creators would have already made the child the centerpiece. Whatever comes next for Holdfast Alaska, Amy is not building toward a channel milestone. She's building toward a winter she and her family can get through on what they've put up themselves. So here's the question worth sitting with. Amy made every hard choice: the home birth, the Craigslist land, the push past the Kenai, and into the true interior, before there was ever an audience watching. Would you trust your instincts enough to make those calls with nobody watching? Let me know below.